Hey there guys, so I just got in the Chuwi RZBOX, which is a Ryzen powered mini PC. I saw it on sale on Amazon and I decided to pick it up because I have been very curious to try out a system with a Ryzen 7 APU. Now you can see here that the package that comes in is pretty gigantic. I was actually surprised to see how big and heavy the box for this ended up being. Now here at the bottom it shows the specs. You can see the Ryzen 7 5800H. We did get 16 gigabytes of RAM and it does have a 512 gigabyte SSD. Now actually opening up the box it comes in, you can see here that we have some protective packaging along with all the documentation that pretty much any product you buy is going to come with, including warranty, though I'm not 100% sure how effective the warranty would really be from a company like Chuwi. But now actually taking out the foam that's in here, we can actually see the device sitting here in very solid packaging overall. I was actually perfectly happy with how this came in here. And just taking out the unit itself, it's surprisingly hefty and big. I was not actually expecting it to be this big. It does actually have a separate power brick, of course. Most mini PCs do have a separate power brick, and here you can see what it is. It is a 90-watt adapter. For the most part, it is pretty rock solid. It does stay well within the range of this, so they didn't underpower this one. Now, actually taking it out of the packaging, you can see here the system itself is surprisingly chonky. Overall, it has a very industrial design, and it does feel very nice to hold in the hand. Now, taking a look at the front, you can see we are greeted by a pretty sparse I/O, but overall pretty solid. Although that USB-C pretty much just being USB 2.0 makes this a kind of weak choice in terms of wanting to have this be a full-on docking station. But overall, it is a pretty rock-solid design, at least aesthetically speaking. It feels solid to the touch, and personally, I am a big fan of this type of industrial design. Reminds me a lot of an embedded system. The back I/O is solid enough with a full-size display port, HDMI, VGA, as well as 2 Ethernet NICs, though with a disappointing amount of USB ports. Now this is a pretty chunky unit. You can see here right next to the B-Link SER5, we're looking at a very much smaller unit here. Both in total width and height, it is just really not comparable at all. They are just two gigantically different types of systems. Unfortunately, I feel like the Chuwi does not actually fully utilize its size in an effective way. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by jumping into Cinebench. Now you can see that the Cinebench scores that we get are actually pretty rock solid. With a multi-core score of 11,300, this was really impressive, especially considering that compared to the 5560U, which is also Zen 3, at the 25 watt TDP of that system, that was 7,610 that I ended up getting, while the 5500U being based off of Zen 2 got a multi-core score at 25 watt TDP of 6,525. But it was while running Cinebench that I actually ran into the first problems overall with this system. As you can see here, within seconds of starting the Cinebench benchmark, we end up with temperatures that pretty much constantly stay at around 100 degrees Celsius. Now the system has a hard TDP of around 54 watts, but it really, because of the heat issues, levels out to around 42 watts sustained. Now the BIOS does have options to adjust the TDP from all the way up to 54 down to 45, then 35, then 25, then 15, and then 10. Unfortunately, none of those settings actually apply. No matter what I've done with the BIOS and no matter what program I've tried to use, I just cannot unlock the TDP of this system. And because of that, we're pretty much just stuck dealing with this horrible cooling, because the cooler that's actually in here is pretty terrible. It does such an awful job trying to dissipate this much heat that I'm shocked that they even continue to sell this unit. I have actually had it shut down twice on me from just, I'm guessing, just reaching really high temperatures twice with Cinebench. So already off to a terrible start. I wanted to see just exactly how bad that would be in games. So firing up Forza Horizon 5, you can see here that at the full 1080p resolution, no upscaler whatsoever, with the ultra low graphics preset, the level of performance that we're getting here is actually surprisingly solid. Running through the entirety of the benchmark 3 times, we got an FPS average of 54 with 1% lows of 40, which means that the overall experience in here at the full 1080p resolution without having to use FSR is just really nice, really impressive. And so far the system temperatures aren't to a level where it's just ungodly, but already just being in the low to mid 80s is pretty concerning. And this is one of the better results that we actually ended up getting. Of course, if we enable FSR and go all the way down to the ultra performance preset, we do actually see a pretty noticeable uplift that did make the experience of actually playing the game pretty nice. I jumped in and just drove around a bit in the open world with both just the low settings, full 1080p, and also with FSR. And FSR did feel a little bit more responsive, though it wasn't a groundbreaking difference by any means. But we did end up with a final FPS average after 3 runs of 62 FPS and 1% lows of 52. So while that was an overall impressive result, I decided to boot up Rainbow Six Siege and see what the performance is actually like in this specific game, and with the lowest in-game graphics settings, which also do set the target resolution to essentially 50% of 1080p and just upscale that, we do actually get a result that was surprising and really impressive. With a final 3-run score of an FPS average of 99 and 1% lows of 86, this is really great results considering that we didn't have to use anything like FSR to actually get this level of performance. And in fact, if we wanted to just get closer to a 60 FPS average, we wouldn't really have to use the temporal upscaling that reduces the render resolution as it is right now. Of course, we can also apply FSR on top of this and see what that does to the overall performance. And doing just that was really impressive. We ended up with an FPS average of 130 after 3 runs and 1% lows of 109. This was a really great result, and honestly, I don't really notice too much of a difference between just turning on FSR at performance mode and also having the temporal upscaling. Visually speaking, there isn't that much of a difference really between the two, and it's kind of just free performance at that point. Not to say that it looks perfect, definitely the temporal resolution drop can be pretty noticeable, but in general, this was just such a pleasure to actually play that it didn't really bother me too much. So after that great result in Rainbow Six Siege, I decided to jump into Doom 2016 to see what the result would be like here at the full 1080p resolution. And overall, the result was pretty rock solid, with 1% lows well within a range that I would think most people would find to be acceptable, and an FPS average that is just slightly above 60. After 3 runs of this mission, I ended up with an FPS average of 61 with 1% lows of 47. Really, this stayed so consistent throughout all of this that pretty much going through all of the footage, the 1% lows and averages would just fluctuate by 1 or 2 FPS at all times. Now, another game that I have been testing pretty frequently lately just because I do enjoy playing it, we have Killing Floor 2. Now, with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution, we were getting really nice levels of performance, with 1% lows that were practically at 60 at all times, and averages that were well within a range that you could actually start to utilize a high refresh rate monitor. After 3 runs of this same map at the exact same settings, we got an FPS average of 81 with 1% lows at 45. Overall, a very enjoyable experience, and I'm glad to see that we didn't even have to drop the resolution down to 720p. Of course, we were riding on such a high there that I had to bring the system down and actually humble it. Our FPS average in the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmark ended up being, after 3 runs, an FPS average of 36 with 1% lows of 32. This is at 1080p, lowest in-game graphics with FSR set to performance mode. So we didn't even have to drop down to 720p to actually get this to be at a playable rate with FSR. This is a interesting development because this actually means that if you have this type of chip, you could actually play this game. Yeah, it's going to be at a really low resolution because of FSR, but it's at least FSR on the base 1080p resolution. This is really impressive. I was actually really blown away by the results here. Unfortunately, the temperatures throughout all of this testing for the system were just crazy, especially because this thing is screaming at me at this point. And by the way, if you were curious of what the performance is like if we do go with 720p and FSR performance mode on top of that, the results are actually really impressive in terms of the numbers overall that we get, with a final 3-run FPS average of 54 and 1% lows of 45. This was a really rock solid experience, but the game just looks so bad that I really can't recommend that you play like this. It just doesn't really make any sense. Now, I wanted to try out a bit more of a modern game on here, since the only other modern one that we've taken a look at is Forza Horizon. Unfortunately, Back 4 Blood it wasn't exactly the greatest performer on here. This is at 1080p base resolution with FSR set to performance mode, and we are running this with the lowest in-game graphics. And while our averages were pretty rock solid, there was just a consistent frame time problems that made the 1% lows pretty much be at below 30 for the entirety of the testing. After running through this same mission 3 times, we ended up with an FPS average of 72 and 1% lows of 27. So the 1% lows really never improved at all. I was hoping that as I played through the game, they would level out just because, you know, DX12 might be just caching shaders. But unfortunately, it just never ended up happening. The result was pretty much consistent throughout all of it. So unfortunately, not a great result here. Not completely unplayable, but just disappointing compared to the other games that we've seen so far. Now, continuing the trend of testing out shooters, here we have Star Wars Battlefront 2 running at the lowest in-game graphics settings with the full 1080p resolution. Now, I personally love playing this game. It's one of those games that I love to just boot up and relax. Anytime I'm doing benchmark tests, it's one of those games that I really look forward to because I could just sit there, play it, listen to a podcast, maybe watch a Twitch stream, and just have a great time. So it was pleasantly surprising to see this game run this well at the full 1080p resolution. We are just slightly below 60 in terms of averages. Our 1% lows are well within a comfortable range. Now, because the game doesn't let you really control what maps you ended up playing on, I didn't do a 3-run test on this. I did play multiple rounds, I just didn't do an average, but just based off of this specific map alone, the FPS average ended up being 55 and 1% lows of 44. And after playing multiple rounds, there was really no major fluctuations or anything, or any major differences that I would think that, oh, some maps are unplayable while others are perfectly playable. I never encountered anything like that. Of course, I have not played on every single map on here, so there might be some that will be problematic, but given the level of performance that I got throughout the different levels that I played, nothing would lead me to believe that there will be a situation like that. So overall, really impressive result. Of course, we can try to lower the resolution if you want to try to squeeze out a bit more performance out of this. And doing so does net us a nice little performance uplift here, with 1% lows now being more than comfortably above 60 at all times, and our averages being just slightly below 90, with a final score on this specific map of 1% lows of 65 and an FPS average of 84. Now, again, same caveats as before, where I have not tried every single map on here, and I couldn't really get an average because you can't really select the maps that you play on. But in general, the level of performance that I got throughout the different rounds that I played was more than adequate. I never felt like at any moment there was any anomalies compared to everything else. So I was just really happy with the result like this. I don't even think dropping the resolution down to this is even necessary, really. And I was using a high refresh rate monitor. It was just one of those things where it played perfectly fine at 1080p, especially since I play the co-op. It's literally just against AI. I don't need it to be like ultra sweat mode. Now, I didn't want Forza Horizon to be the only racing game that I tried out, so here we have Need for Speed Heat running with the lowest in-game graphics settings. Now, overall, the game performs really well at the full 1080p resolution, considering we were essentially getting a rock solid 30 FPS average. Now, the final result pretty much ended up being an average of 37 with 1% lows of 30, which means that while we're not at a high refresh rate experience, it is at least consistent enough that you can play like this perfectly fine. And visually speaking, the game does look really nice. Of course, we can try to drop the resolution and see if that improves the overall performance. And doing just that gives us some really impressive results, with an FPS average at 720p of 63 FPS and a 1% low of 44. The results that we got here were really solid. If you really care about having a higher refresh rate in this game, dropping down to 720p does seem to be pretty effective. Of course, Need for Speed Heat is not the latest title in this franchise, so we can take a look at Need for Speed Unbound. Now, one of the additions to this game is the fact that it supports FSR. So we have FSR running with the full 1080p resolution, FSR set to the performance preset, and really the level of performance that we get here with the lowest in-game graphics settings is actually really impressive, since overall the results were pretty comparable or even better than what we were getting with Need for Speed Heat, with a final result of 41 FPS and 1% lows of 33. The overall experience here was actually really impressive, and I was not expecting that for a brand new title like this. But FSR at performance mode is actually doing some pretty impressive work here. We didn't even need to drop down to 720p. And of course, I wanted to round out the game testing with a title that I think is more likely to be played on a system like this than anything else. We have Valorant. Now, this is running at the lowest lowest in-game graphics settings, but we are at the full 1080p resolution, and we're getting a more than comfortably high enough FPS for high refresh rate gaming. This was almost pretty much constantly saturating the 144 hertz display that I was using this with, and it felt really nice to play. Pretty much the only thing that was holding me back is just the fact that I use a wireless mouse for this system, and it can be really annoying to try to play a game like this with a wireless mouse that at this point is relatively old. It's not one of those really low latency ones. It's like it's an old Logitech G602 where I even get Wi-Fi interference that just like ruins the signal of the connection. So overall, a really solid result considering the fact that the IO I was using was not exactly the best for this kind of game. But I was so impressed by the results here that I was legitimately just blown away. This is such a massive leap in comparison to all the other systems, and a big part of it is the fact that we have a higher IPC on the CPU and it can also clock higher. You can see that the GPU isn't even really at 100% utilization throughout this. We are still in a lot of ways CPU limited here. If the CPU could go pretty much all the way to 5 gigahertz, maybe that'll undo the bottleneck there, but outside of that, really nice results. But the biggest disappointment is also look at those temperatures. We are at over 100 degrees just playing Valorant, a game that is getting a mobile release soon, and it's spiking this APU up to 100C. It's ridiculous stuff, and overall it was really just disappointing to see considering just how good the 5800H is. And really, that's my overall conclusion with this specific system. It just runs way too hot for how big and loud this system gets. I mean, it's a chonker of a machine, but it's a waste because all of the cooling potential is just ridiculous. I mean, again, compared to the other mini PC, it's ginormous, and it can't even keep temperatures even remotely within a safe range. And it's just screeching at you while you have it at your desk. So overall, I don't recommend this mini PC. The chip itself is actually really impressive, and if we could actually get it in a system that could cool this properly, this would be amazing. So I don't recommend you get this specific one, but I will link down below in the description some mini PCs that have much better cooling than this, that don't have problems of it just randomly shutting down on you, because the chip it has in there is really nice, but the whole system built around it is just really disappointing.